By the way, folks, we forgot to ask you to turn off your smartphones, please. So please do that. And if you do turn off your smartphone, how can you be sure it's really off, being so smart as it is, which is our subject today? If you ask Siri to assure you that she had turned it off, would you believe her? Used to be a silly question, but it isn't anymore. I'm old enough to remember when we only had 3 forms of long-distance communication. You're never going to believe this, but we had dial telephones. They were connected to a hard wire to the wall or somewhere. We had not only dial telephones, but we also had paper envelopes. We'd write and put something in the envelope and fix a sticky stamp to it, and it might get to wherever it's going in a week or 2, maybe. Usually pretty good, though. And then for emergencies, for long-distance communication, we had telegrams. They were very expensive because you had to pay a lot of money per word, so they were very short usually. But a lot of you now are younger than that, and you probably don't remember such days clearly when long-distance communications were so taken for granted. So when our device wasn't there to get information for us, to order food, to get rides, to make friends, to meet people all over the world we could not have met otherwise, much less possibly bonded with, well, move fast and break things was Silicon Valley's rallying cry for the titans of technology who spouted noble goals to bring us together. And for years, tech companies have rarely gotten much scrutiny in terms of how their systems impacted society. But last year, we've lately noticed there's been a reckoning, a wake-up call for data scientists and society. So tonight, we're going to start with a short film to remind us about all of that, as if we needed it. Take a look.
Facebook is an idealistic and optimistic company. For most of our existence, we focused on all of the good that connecting people can do.
Mr. Zuckerberg, what is Facebook doing to prevent foreign actors from interfering in U.S. elections?
If you've messaged anybody this week, would you share with us the names of the people you've messaged?
Senator, no, I would probably not choose to do that publicly here.
I think that may be what this is all about.
Do you believe you're more responsible with millions of Americans' personal data than the federal government would be?
The early intent is really interesting and fascinating to study. It was a time where pretty much everyone who was involved was really optimistic about what it could mean.
The web is going to be the defining social moment for computing.
It would give free access to knowledge to people whenever they needed it.
It suddenly seemed to shrink the world, and suddenly even being apart of vast distances from people didn't matter as much. Move fast and break things, kids coming out of dorm rooms and starting companies. All the walls that used to separate people from information and from each other were being broken down and used to create again a new, open, egalitarian world. American society, American political culture allowed these companies to grow and to mediate all our interactions now that we have.
People were thinking like, is technology good for us? Is the internet good for us? This will change everything. I think it was clear that the main goal was like to get it to a stable version and monetize it.
Business is working well. The majority of our revenues, of course, are in advertising.
No one really knew how fast things would evolve. No one really knew how quickly, basically how willingly platforms were willing to kind of like sell out users.
When I first started covering Silicon Valley, I began to try to understand how Silicon Valley companies like Facebook and Google made money. What was their business model? The earliest moment that I can remember when privacy became an issue in the internet experience was in 2004 when Google launched Gmail. And it was going to do that, it was going to finance this by essentially reading all your emails and then serving you targeted advertising. This was a new thing for most people because people didn't realize how Google was financing its operations until then. And suddenly people became much more savvy about what was happening on the internet.
A decade ago, like 15 years ago, I would not have thought this was possible. Not just in terms of ethically, but also technology-wise. Changing your privacy settings at this point is, like rearranging the chairs of the Titanic, in a way. Not only because already a lot of this data has been collected and curated, but also because even when you change your settings, there are ways for people to still scrape information from these websites.
The thing that is interesting to me the most currently is the role that algorithms play in the formation of these online communities.
The way these algorithms work is they find patterns in data by looking at what humans have provided them as kind of examples. This is one area where bias could actually be introduced into algorithms. If you think of a word like CEO and a word like man, most likely what you will see if you map them into this vector space is that you have man here, most likely CEO is going to be very close to man, but very far away from woman.
Looking at this type of algorithm, you could also envision how a system like Google would start to use these type of results.
People are really pushing forward for these algorithms to be used in every facet of human life without actually understanding fully the consequences.
Social media has the power to bring people together formally, like without a voice. We've seen like hopeful stories like the Arab Spring. We've seen the Me Too movement. We've seen Black Lives Matter.
The internet is a great organizing tool. Are we better off now after the internet has come into existence than we were 30 years ago? Well, it's changed it. It's made some things much better. But again, influence is how it makes money.
Platforms generally need to acknowledge that they have responsibility. Users should have a reasonable amount of trust in a platform, in a service they're using, that their data is not being sold.
Some of these companies have started to realize the role that they've played and are moving towards implementing solutions to that end.
Here's the question that all of us got to answer, given what's happened here, why we should let you self-regulate.
Well, Senator, my position is not that there should be no regulation. Okay. I think the internet is increasingly
important. You embrace
important.
regulation?
So, we're going to begin our program with one of the forefathers of virtual reality. He was there in the beginning, since the early 1980s, I believe. He helped craft a vision for the internet as a way to bring people together. He's a scientist, a musician, and an author, and his new book is 10 Arguments for Deleting Your Social Media Accounts Right Now. Please welcome Jaron Lanier. Jaron, good to see you.
Hello, hello.
So, you say you're an optimist.
And yet I note that we're having our proceedings in the theater of a criminal law, which maybe is a little too appropriate. I sort of feel like...
Well, you've said that we don't have to throw the whole thing away, but you also say that this internet AI has turned us into Pavlovian dogs carrying around devices suitable for what you call mass behavior modification. What do you mean by that?
Well, there was a time when we used the mail and telegrams that you referred to, which I'm also old enough to remember. And I should point out, when you sent a letter by mail, nobody else read it. You paid for it, but it was strictly your business. It was a remarkable thing, almost unimaginable today. So in those days, you could find yourself under observation by somebody who's trying to be sneaky and manipulate you. One way to do it would be to volunteer for a psychology test in the basement of the psych building on campus, and then some undergraduates would be behind the one-way mirror trying to get you to do something. Or you could get into an abusive relationship, or you could join a cult. You could find yourself on the wrong side of an interrogation desk. There are all kinds of ways it could happen, but they were all very localized and unusual. Now it's happening to everybody. Everybody is under constant observation and constant manipulation, albeit, just to be very clear, it's slight. So At this point, the degree of observation is less than in the scenarios I just described, although it's getting more so every day.
And the title of your book, forgive me for interrupting, but it sounds kind of extreme. Cut ourselves off from all social media right now?
Yeah. Well, yeah, sure. Well, you guys all just delete this stuff, then I don't have to talk about this anymore. So just, the thing is, slight differences, slight behavior modification applied consistently over time can shift society. It's like compound interest. At any particular moment, you might say, oh, how much difference could it make? So I saw an ad from the Russian intelligence warfare people, so it got me a little cranky over something or other, who cares? But cumulatively, it does have a statistical effect on the whole society. And then as far as why I'm asking people to quit, I'll tell you why. It's because I love Silicon Valley. I love making digital products. I've sold a company to Google. I'm working with Microsoft. I adore my community. It's my home. And I don't want you to be passive sheep customers. I want you to be demanding, tough customers, and I want you to make us work to make you happy. And right now, you're all turning into passive sheep, and it bugs me. All right. So if you quit, you're at least prodding us. You're at least not just sitting there passively accepting whatever we feed you. So I think it would be better for us. So I want you to challenge us, because that way we're not disconnected from the world anymore. Can you see that? Like, when you engage with Silicon Valley, when you're tough, you're actually saving us from being like abandoned on some desolate island of the super empowered. You know, like you actually help us. You actually reconnect the world.
Reconnect the world.
Yeah.
To get precise about what you're saying, the trend lines are being watched in how we do respond in tiny bits, are being watched by algorithms that can see what the trend is pointing to, and so it subtly changes our behavior. Is that how it works?
Yeah. The way it works is there are very few sort of sneaky people in cubicles trying to figure out how to manipulate you directly. I mean, the Russians have some in their employ, but the much more common thing that makes the whole system work is algorithms. So the algorithm will do a little bit of random stuff. It'll say, well, during what time of the month is this person more susceptible to this kind of pitch? What about other people who correlate with this person in some ways? And all of these correlations turn into this statistical I wouldn't call it a model of you, because it wouldn't pass muster as a scientific model, but it's kind of a predictive portrait of you that can be used slightly reliably. I mean, this stuff is only barely better than random, but it is a little better than random. And so it gradually finds a way to engage with you. We use the word engage instead of addict. What I mean is addict. We gradually addict you through algorithmic exploration until we find whatever it is that'll get you.
Indeed. We've seen people complaining on Facebook about Facebook apparently doing that sort of thing. The Russians, for example, the Russian ads, democracy threatened. What's the business model behind all of that?
Well, the business model is, it's really kind of interesting. I've had occasion to be at these events where all the Silicon Valley companies sell their biggest advertisers big package deals for the next year. And it's an amazing spectacle to behold, because each of the companies in turn, Facebook and Google and so on, will grab a stage and then present to the biggest advertising buyers. Often, I kid you not, with dancers and special effects. It's like this big production. And if you listen to the way the companies talk about what they can do to their own customers, the advertisers, you hear this extraordinary bragging, like, we can really nail in on a person, we can get them to do something, we can, and it's actually a little exaggerated. And then the public face is, oh, no, we only do things in your interest. But it really is kind of two-faced. There's this very aggressive way that the companies sell themselves. And I think what happens to the advertisers, to the people who are putting all these many billions of dollars into the system, is they get scared, because they're thinking, oh my God, if we don't pay into these companies, it's like we won't exist. It's kind of like an existential version of a mafia sort of protection racket. It's like you're saying, like, you pay us or nobody will know about you. And so I think while the official version is that we're giving you the ads so that they're more useful, and then the sales version is we're able to mind control people for your benefit, the actual truth is we're going to scare you into thinking if you don't give us money, you'll cease to exist. So I think those are the three different versions of the same business plan.
And if I'm not mistaken, you've actually written somewhere that all of this is turning us into, these are your words, quote, you said, into assholes, unquote.
Right. Well, I wanted to sound presidential.
So let me ask you another question.
I should say something about that. Oh, I see that. What happens is when you get somebody addicted to something, whether it's an opioid or social media, their personality changes. They get kind of cranky and selfish. There's this thing, anybody who's known an addict will recognize this, and social media addicts do tend to get this quality, which is sometimes called the snowflake personality, where it's almost like they're asking for a fight. They want attention so badly. And so it does kind of make you into that thing that was mentioned.
Right. So you said this is so-called advertising, but you really consider it something more like continuous behavior modification rather than advertising.
Yeah, I'd prefer to call engagement what it is, which is addiction, and I'd prefer to call advertising what it is. Now, advertising started out as real advertising. Back when Google was founded, it was more like advertising. But when you're constantly watching for what a message does to a person and adapting it on a very rapid basis, we can't call it advertising anymore. That's something new and different, and that should be called continuous behavior modification.
And I've heard you've pointed out that some of the tech titans, of which there are not that many, don't let their kids go anywhere near technology. They send them to schools. They send them to schools that
yeah, they tend to, in the Bay Area, they tend to go to the hippy-dippy anti-tech schools. Yeah, that's true. And I know some of my friends in the industry are shocked. I kind of let my daughter do whatever she wants. I figure she has to learn her own lessons, and they're shocked. Like, you let her have a phone? I'm like, well, she's going to have to figure it out. But a lot of people are like incredibly anti-tech within the tech community. It's rather remarkable.
And you've also said that this is approaching something like the divine right of kings, turning us into people who are following without realizing that we're following, but we're just giving over to it anyway?
It is the strangest thing. Like, I don't have anything against the individuals I'll mention, because a lot of them are people I know, but it's really weird. Like, one of the tech companies is the first large public company controlled by a single person, and has all of this power, and like, why should that be so? It's a very peculiar thing, but we had such a fervent belief in the myth of the hacker cowboy who would dent reality, in the words of Steve Jobs, that somehow we're enacting it. One of the things I'm a little concerned of, actually, is that sometimes when a society chooses figures to be godlike figures, then they'll tear them down. So they'll elect a Mussolini and then hang the Mussolini, or they'll elect the Aztec prince for a year and then sacrifice that person. And I'm a little concerned about some kind of wave of hatred against tech, which would be totally inappropriate, because we actually are doing something important. What I ask is not to hate us, but to engage us and force us to be better. That's the much better scenario.
I can understand that, yet we've seen examples lately where it's being pointed out to us that the smartphones conveying what they're able to convey are turning into propagators of maniacal social violence, weaponized in Myanmar, in the Rohingya problem. And in South Sudan, social media is literally a deadly weapon in South Sudan. Explain that.
Yeah, so this has been one of the awful things that's happened. Early on, Silicon Valley is part of the Bay Area in California and tends to swing left, right? And very early on, there was this I would say a certainty that if you just let people talk to each other, it'll create positive leftist changes in the world. And one of the first great triumphs of that was the Arab Spring. Like, oh, we'll just give power to the people, they'll overthrow dictators, they'll create this beautiful democracy. Now, the thing is, the algorithms that are watching participants in something like the Arab Spring aren't left or right. They're not humanistic. They have no feelings at all. They're just trying to find any path to maximize addiction and maximize influence algorithmically, just through searching. And eventually, the algorithms discover in a blind algorithmic way that the negative emotions, the negative people are easier to engage, and so everything starts tilting towards amplifying those people. So you'll have an ISIS that gets even more mileage from the same tools that propelled an Arab Spring, or you'll get a resurgent KKK and neo-Nazi movie that gets even more mileage from the same nexus of communications that propelled the Black Lives Matter, right, is an example that happened here. And we see this again and again. Can I get just slightly geeky for a second?
Please, please.
Okay, so...
you geeks have given this to us, so...
Yeah, okay. So, well, then thank you for giving us another chance to screw you up here. In classical behaviorism, the earliest experiments used things like candy and electric shocks to give people stimulus in response to what they did to change their behavior, right? That's the Skinner box. Now, we don't yet have drones hovering over people dropping candy or electric shocks on them, right? That's coming. But it's not here yet. So we use symbols like analogous to Pavlov's bell, but we use social experience to give people little dopamine hits, as we call them in the trade, the little positive feeling when you get retweeted or something, and then the negative ones when you get treated badly, when you get harassed online, insulted. And so the thing is that in a broad sense, positive and negative stimuli are both powerful in people, but they have different time profiles. So what happens is the positive ones can take longer to build and can be broken more quickly, and the negative ones can come up faster. So it's faster to get startled or scared than it is to relax, but it takes longer to build trust than it takes to lose trust. So you can see they're reverses. And so since the algorithms are responding on a rapid feedback loop, they select out and amplify the negative stuff, and that's why ISIS gets more mileage than the Arab Spring, and that's why the Klan gets more mileage than Black Lives Matter.
Well, speaking of time and quickness and slowness, if there's any left, you kind of shocked me when you wrote that it's completely normal, if I read it correctly, to hear tech execs talk about the coming singularity, and you say it's analogous to the evangelical rapture, to an apocalypse. Really?
Oh yeah, that's like Silicon Valley religion, yeah.
So what's the solution? Do we have to step away and abandon the free model?
I think there's a variety of possible solutions. The one that I'm really interested in is changing the underlying business model. So if you have an underlying business model where the only way you can make a penny, I mean, what we're doing now is so insane. Can you imagine if in the old days, if you mailed somebody a letter, instead of buying postage, the letter would be free, but some customer would only pay money if they were confident they could change the letter in a way that they would influence events. That would be extraordinary, right? But that's exactly what we've done. Right now, if you and I are to have contact over the internet, this thing that's supposed to be open and free, the only way that can be financed is by a third party who we don't know about, who wishes to influence us both. And so once you have that business model, it's like this red carpet invitation to the Russians and other bad actors and the Klan and whoever to use it, because they can get incredible mileage out of it, of a disruptive and negative sort. So bring back postage, make it paid, let pay. In the days when Facebook was being founded, everybody thought that the way movies and TV would be created would be like the Wikipedia. It would be this massive volunteer free thing. Everybody in Silicon Valley, not in Hollywood. We had an honest test. That was tried. A lot of people tried to do that, but then we had Netflix, HBO, Hulu, etc. And it turns out that when people pay for TV, we got this thing called peak TV. We did an honest test, we got an honest result. So what I want Facebook to turn into, I don't want the good stuff in Facebook to disappear. I think there's a lot of extremely positive stuff that happens on social media. I want it to turn into a cross between Netflix and Etsy. I want you to pay for it like you pay for Netflix so you can get peak social media, but if you do something special that means a lot, I want you to be able to get money for your craft like you would on Etsy. So I want that to be the future of Facebook.
Sounds good, but to get a little bit realistic, that would take an awful lot of change. Do you think any technology company would actually go for this?
They'll do better. I mean, this is just normal capitalism. It's like this idea of people coming in from the side and getting in the middle of everybody and manipulating society as the only business model is not capitalism. It's some bizarre dystopic thing. I mean, I'm suggesting just normal capitalism. Like, people pay for stuff they like and they have a choice about it. It's just normal. And I think it would be better for Facebook. It would be better for Google. I think it'd be better for everybody. I think their shareholders would be happy. I think it's just a better solution.
If we could figure out how to have that happen all at once. But let me ask you one other question.
All right.
You've said that this is all making politics impossible as we understand it. And I must say, because the way the rights of individuals for voting and all was conceived in an age when we didn't have any of this magical stuff, it's changed the definition of politics almost.
Yeah, I mean, we live in a bizarre world now that just happened recently. I feel sorry for young people who couldn't experience the contrast with what came earlier, where nothing seems real, everything seems like it's manipulated by unseen forces. Everybody's on edge all the time. Now, not that we had utopia before, but we had a little bit more reality. And we must get back there to survive. I don't see how we can survive if we're insane.
Of course, some people say if we go back 80, 90 years, we have a world that was giving us horrible war, and maybe there wasn't enough communication between people. I mean, Siri in my pocket can connect me live to anybody on the planet right now, and plug in a translator if I don't speak the language. People are doing that.
In general, the countries that have started wars have been ones that were run by leaders who were attempting to control the thoughts of their whole population. You see this kind of crazy power mongering in both communist states and in traditional monarchies. And so what you have is you have a leader who's saying, I will control what my subjects think, I am God, I will control everything. And then they clash with somebody else who's trying to do that, and the two things aren't compatible. That happened when we confronted communist regimes, for instance. And in fact, some of the remaining communist regimes after the Cold War were the greatest experimenters with this massive mind control, the Stasi in East Germany. And North Korea now is attempting a low-tech version of mind control. So I think if we can give it up, if we can have genuinely distributed power, I think we actually start to approach a more peaceful world, which we were doing until these stupid problems started to reverse. Do you realize we were on a trend where there were fewer and fewer wars and more democracies, and then all of a sudden that arc has fallen just recently.
So to sum up, you're suggesting that we may be heading towards somewhere where cloud control is in charge of crowd control, so to speak. Only it may also be out of control by itself. It may be a chaotic thing, so it's frightening.
Well, if it was genuinely out of control, if it was really random, it might be better. But because it has that quirk I mentioned, where it emphasizes the nastiest people as a matter of course, it does tend to bring up the assholes, the cranky people, the paranoid people, the control freaks. It tends to empower those kinds of people. More than people who want to be measured, want to think ahead, and so it's not quite out of control enough to be survivable.
But one big question is whether anyone's criticism will matter.
Yeah, well, that's the question. I gotta say, I'm an optimist, largely because of what you brought up just now. We've faced extraordinary wars, extraordinary evils, and we've come through. And so the human track record of dealing with human stupidity is extraordinary, that we've made it this far, right? But I'm convinced that the way you make it is not through complacency. So there's this bit of a confusion on this matter. Sometime in the Silicon Valley atmosphere, there's this thing like, well, if you're optimistic, it means you're complacent because you're sure things will work out automatically. It'll just naturally get better. I don't think that's ever been true. I think we have progressed and things have gotten better, and the various trend lines of betterment are very real, but every single increment of that betterment was due to somebody putting their foot down and saying things can be better.
Jaron, Lanier, thank you very much for joining us and ending on a positive note. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
So, what is the science behind these AI systems that are impacting everything from the news you read, healthcare, who gets hired, promoted, deported, released from jail, recruited to university, who gets a loan or insurance? These technologies are changing the way we live. They're making unseen automated and semi-automated decisions, and important ones, often in obscurity. What does living in a world run by algorithms mean? Joining us now to dig deeper into all of this is Hwang, director of the Harvard-MIT Ethics and Governance AI Initiative, and the former Google Global Public Policy Lead for Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning. Please welcome Tim Hwang. Tim? Meredith Whittaker, co-founder of the AI Now Institute that's based at NYU. She is a research scientist and founder of the Google Open Research Group. Please welcome Meredith Whittaker. Aviv Ovadya is chief technologist at the Center for Social Media Responsibility at the University of Michigan School of Information. He has worked and provided research for Amazon, the MIT Media Lab, for Morgan Stanley, Quora, Yodel, the Tow Center for Digital Journalism, and Google. Please welcome Aviv Ovadya. And last but not least, Brett Frischmann, a professor of law, business, and economics at Villanova University. He's also an affiliated scholar of the Center for Internet Society at Stanford Law School. His latest book is entitled Re-Engineering Humanity. Please welcome Brett Frischmann. So AI is now embedded in our lives in many ways that are invisible to us. What do people need to know about it? We need to know what's the good and what's the bad. And let's start with Brett. Your book, Re-Engineering Humanity, posits that technology is turning us into machines. Is it?
Well, the idea behind the book is to get us to ask ourselves how often in our life you feel like or you behave as if automatically or comparable to a machine, right? So the idea of thinking about, am I performing a script? Am I behaving habitually or automatically? And if so, who wrote that script? So the idea is to think more and more about how the technical systems, the world we're building or really engineering for ourselves affects who we are as human beings. And how we think, how we relate to each other, how we interact with each other in different settings.
Tim, let me ask you about the good and bad. AI seems to put the label on everything. It seems to be a label that's put on everything these days.
It sure is.
What does the term AI really mean in the context that we have here?
Sure.
Training computers to perform tasks. How do you train a computer?
That's right. So when you talk about AI, it's important to keep two things separate. One of them is the marketing of AI, which is what you're referring to. And then there's this sort of computer science of AI. And really, that is a subfield of artificial intelligence that's known as machine learning. And the basics of machine learning that you need to know is it's sort of the study of algorithms that get better the more data that they see. So the notion is if you want to teach a machine to understand how to recognize a cat in an image, you show it lots of images of cats. And there's a certain set of methodologies that are used to allow it to kind of accomplish that task. And really, that's the sort of subfield that's been driving really a lot of the progress that you've seen in the last few years.
Indeed, the same technology is used to detect humor that is used to detect tumors, is used on Facebook news feeds, facial recognition systems. These machines are they're learning machines. How does that really work?
So a lot of it is based on the recognition of what's known as features. So for example, if you imagine trying to recognize a cat, the example that I just gave you earlier, back in the day, the idea is that you get a bunch of programs together to think about how they recognize a cat themselves, and then they'd program explicit rules into a machine. So they'd say, well, a cat's fuzzy, and a cat is usually these kinds of colors, and you'd actually put those rules in. One of the unique things about machine learning, though, is that it's able to identify these features sort of by itself. After lots and lots of examples, machines can do sort of what they call inference. They're able to say, well, in all the cases that I've seen, these are the types of things that are associated with cats. And it turns out that once you do it that way, you get these systems that are much, much better than we had before in doing these types of tasks.
Better, smarter?
Sure, depending on how you define smart.
That's part of our problem here today. So Meredith, in many cities you start your day walking down the street, your face is being recorded on all kinds of hidden cameras, not hidden sometimes. Your geolocation is being tracked, and this is all before you jump on an app where you likely gave permission for your data and movements to be ingested, often without actually reading the fine print, which is sometimes intentionally unreadable because it's so dense. You've said that we've rushed these technologies into some of the most sensitive areas of our lives, into criminal justice, healthcare, hiring, and labor. Can you explain some examples of this issue and explain what this makes you feel?
I'm going to ask your permission to go off script immediately and sort of you answer the question you asked to Tim, because I think we need to sort of set up where we are right now socially and politically, and then we can get into some of the examples. But when you ask what AI is, I have been in the tech industry for almost 12 years now. I have thought a lot about these issues. That's not an easy question to answer, even for somebody who is sort of enmeshed in these technologies. And that's partly because, while it's an old field, over 60 years old, it is kind of newly adopted in the last 5 to 10 years. And everyone can attest to this. You can't pass a newsstand without seeing, another shiny white robot and some promise of kind of singularity futures, right? And I think we have to ask, okay, why is this, right? Why did this just crop up like mushrooms everywhere we go? And when you ask that question, you begin to see that, this happened right around the time that big tech corporations were consolidating, that this business model had sort of taken over, and where finally you have these sort of organizations that have incredible compute power. They have supercomputing infrastructure. They're actually able to process the massive amounts of data that is needed to, as Tim said, sort of train these systems to recognize patterns. They have this data because they have vast market reach, and they're able, from Facebook to Google to, whatever other app you've installed, they are able to continually collect huge amounts of data. They have the infrastructure to store it, and then they have incredibly talented engineers that they can afford to pay to build these algorithms. So we look at this as sort of a commodification of a, earlier, fairly theoretical kind of, I would say, not a prominent branch of computer science for many years that suddenly became marketable. And so we have to ask, when we look at AI, whose stories are we hearing? And a lot of times what we're hearing are the stories that are written by the marketing departments of the corporations that have recognized the marketability and the profitability of these, these techniques that have been around for a while.
And that raises questions of motive. For example, you have written and spoken about the fact that there are algorithms that claim to be able to discover which people are more likely to commit a crime, more likely to commit a crime. That sounds to me like it's crossing a very serious legal line, giving motives to people who want to...
Absolutely. And you have to ask, if you look at one of the sort of companies that has claimed to be able to do this, and there are sort of researchers and sort of businesses that are looking at this as a technology, is Axon, which used to be called Taser, which has a huge cache of police body cam data. So they acquired 2 AI companies about 1.5 years ago and are busy creating sort of real-time facial recognition systems that will analyze the data captured by police body cams. Now their premise is, hey, police encounter criminals, we have this data set that will then model criminality, we'll train the AI to see what a criminal looks like. If you're thinking like eugenics, physiognomy, phrenology, you're right. And then we will be able to identify pre-crime.
Innocent until proven guilty sounds like it's under some kind of threat.
Yeah. And maybe Tim can pick up on exactly how the data that they would be using is generated and the sort of racial bias built into our criminal justice and policing systems.
Minorities don't get served so well?
I'm sorry, I missed that.
Minorities could be...
Yes. I mean, we have a racist policing system that creates a lot of the data that would then be fed into these models that would then be tech washed and amplify a lot of that bias in very dangerous ways.
Yeah, and I think this is part of the concern around the sort of marketing of it, right? Because I think there is such a big feeding frenzy over the promise of the technology, and that's often quite at odds with what the technology can actually do. And so I think part of the concern is that you actually see this technology being deployed in all sorts of situations where it's not ready for prime time and may not ever be ready for prime time. I think we have to ask the categorical question of, even if it worked as well as we believed it did, would it still be something we'd want to do?
And its effect on the labor force, unemployment? Aviv?
I mean, again, stepping back just a second, one of the real issues with sort of speaking categorically about these things is that they are being deployed without our knowledge. So we don't know how often we encounter a system that classifies us, and as the classified, we don't often know that the results, the opportunities we're given or denied, the resources we're given or denied, were actually informed by an algorithmic backend system. There is no transparency about these systems. We don't have standardized ways to measure them, and they're often sold by vendors to businesses without informing the public. This is a huge issue. I can talk about what we do know about their impact, but I think we need to sort of level set there that there is a huge need for transparency and accountability.
Aviv, and then do you think that people, since we've heard about the Facebook scandal and we've heard about some of the things, do you think people do understand this threat better now?
I think far better than they did, let's say, 3 months ago, 6 months ago, a year ago, year and a half ago. Like The good part of a lot of the current crises is that at least people are more aware of the way in which technology is impacting their day-to-day, what information they consume, how they're being manipulated in some cases, and also the recommendation systems that affect like what they see and what they believe. And I think that just the fact that algorithm has become a word that many people know is a new phenomenon, I think, over the last year. I think that is very valuable, because in the same way that government is a word people need to know, algorithm is a word people need to know.
Brett?
Well, I was just going to jump in on the point earlier about the impact on the workforce, just to make two quick points. One is what's driving the deployment across industries and in different contexts is sort of an infatuation with supposedly smart systems that we think might be smarter by virtue of having more data, but which are not necessarily demonstrably smarter in a meaningful way in terms of outcomes. And then on the workforce thing, so the work, Karen Levy's done some great work studying the trucking industry. And she gave a great presentation last week, and this is a perfect segue into it, where she emphasized much of the attention is about AI and robots replacing humans, substituting for humans in various workplaces. And that's an important question, and it's worth thinking about. But it's too easy to focus on that aspect and use of the technology and not on another one, which is the actual deployment of technology around, about, and even in the truckers themselves. Like, how are the truckers currently driving impacted by the smart technical systems? Sometimes it's things that are to keep them awake. It's facial recognition that's going in real time. It's lights that flash to keep you awake when you're driving. Whole host of technologies deployed in the cabs of trucks today. And it's not about replacing those humans with the technology or with machines. It's about arguably having those truckers behave more like machines in the truck.
Right, and I think another way at this is actually, I think it is worth busting up this narrative of, well, the kind of inherent nature of the machine is to like replace human labor, yes. Right? Because I think we often forget that these are very much questions of design, right? It's not just a question of what the technology can do, but there's also a question of like, why are people deploying it in the way that they are? And
there's another issue that you're all, I think, heading towards, is the fact that a small handful of people who are designing a lot of these come from, well, they're white men in the Bay Area, basically. Reminds me of Anita Hill some years ago giving her testimony to a panel of all male white senators. So you're nodding.
As the woman of the panel. Yes, they are. And they're white men in the Bay Area, in the Western context. And they are of a similar upper middle class to very rich social strata. They are often educated with exactly the same background, because to do this, we're not just talking about going to coding camp. We're talking about like a series of very specific advanced degrees. And this is, for all the best intentions, and some of these people are my dear friends, that's a worldview. And that's a worldview that is embedded in, say, the features you choose to emphasize in your cat detection, right? That's a worldview that's embedded in how you, say, understand gender classification, how you understand some of these softer relational categories. That's a worldview that becomes baked into this technology that then, scales globally, seriously globally, in ways that are sort of remapping, the world according to that vision. And that's we should be worried about that. We should be worried about who gets to create the normative categories that we are then asked to fit into, because we only have to look at, say, the DSM until 2012 classified being trans as a mental disorder, right? So the people who write the normative categories, write what is acceptable and not acceptable, and that's part of what these technologies are doing.
And indeed, the data scientist Cathy O'Neill has termed a coin for algorithms that are secret and harmful, weapons of math destruction.
Yeah, it's a good pun.
So the key thing, one thing that would help discourse about these issues is to always remember that AI is, always will be, always should be nothing more than a tool designed, owned, managed, deployed by human beings. And so whenever you're talking about AI and its impact or its influence or claims, it's never claims by AI, it's claims about AI made by purveyors of AI. And so it's looking behind, peeking behind the hood, looking who owns it, who designs it, who manages it, and it tends to be concentrated in certain ways.
But go ahead.
I would just quickly add to that, because I completely agree. We also need to look at whose power it serves.
Yes.
Because when we're talking about the workplace examples you gave, which I right on, right? When is the last time you went to a CVS and the automated checkout worked, right? It's not replacing us anytime soon. But what it is what it is doing is it is increasingly monitoring, surveilling, and determining which workers are, valuable, good, and promotable, and which aren't. And of course, this is trained on data gathered from the current workforce, which shows, deep skews and inequity. And I can get into some examples there. But, this is a question of power alongside a question of exactly how the technology is constructed.
Aviv?
And just to add one thing beyond that, it's not just what power it serves, but it's also what power it entrenches. As a result of this technology, like being deployed in this way, who now has more power than they had before, and what can they now do with that?
But couldn't it be argued that AI can be used to provide more objective assessments than humans, reducing bias and leading to their outcomes? Brett,
Sure.
It's been said.
It certainly can be in certain contexts where we can make an evaluation of AI relative to a human making a determination of that sort. So certainly.
And we have to figure out how we're going to be able to tell for sure when we're getting clear, honest behavior. Let me just ask a different question. Are there some areas, do any of you feel, where this new technology should never be used? Some institutions where algorithms should never be used?
I think we should. I'm not going to call for a moratorium on stage, but I think we should really examine the use of facial recognition systems. Who is using them? How are they being used, especially in criminal justice context? I think the question is not, do I want to put my foot down and say never here ever? I think the question is, what proof do we have that they work, and how do we validate that? And in most cases, we have very little proof at all. We haven't even started developing the mechanisms to say, like, this is actually safe. This actually, works across populations. This actually does what the marketing department says it does. So I think the more sensitive the area we deploy it into, say education, healthcare, et cetera, the more we have to wait until we have those techniques in place before we trust it.
Yeah, I think that being said, though, I think it is interesting chasing after problems where even if we did all that verification, it turns out that it is better, like that for other values and other reasons we might still say no. Yeah. I think those classes are a very tricky set of classes where I think, like in a justice context specifically, where we could actually imagine, well, maybe we actually do introduce these systems that are measurably better, but maybe there's something about justice or providing the death sentence that actually requires like a human to be
So
in
the
that
relevant
loop,
question
right?
is what's better, right?
Sure.
Right. Better in terms of accuracy with respect to a scientifically defined or computation problem that we can all agree on, or better in terms of some set of values that may very well be about fairness, equity, due process, or other values that aren't necessarily easily captured in a sort of an empirical question about accuracy. And those are constantly trade-offs across a whole host of areas. So one way to think about it is, for every given case to be made in favor of using AI as a tool in a particular context of the sort your question raised.
Like a private doctor's office, for example?
Right, so you should compare alternative tools. Comparing various tools in context provides a means for thinking about accuracy, effects, power relationships, who's behind the tools, where's the information flow that, behind the scenes, or where is information coming and going from. Those are all a host of complex contextual variables that aren't easily even, captured in most of the conversations about AI.
I would also add that we need to also think about sort of what are the checks and balances that we're putting into place as we deploy these systems. Maybe it does make sense in this context, even in this criminal justice context, as we consider the trade-offs and our values around it, which is absolutely crucial. But then, what are the checks to make sure that this is being used in the way that we want it to be used? Because if we're just dealing with black box systems, that doesn't necessarily fly in some contexts.
Right, and so now let's look at some more variables we have to add into this recent phenomenon of fake news, which first popped up before the 2016 election. We began seeing dubious news stories online that were engineered for maximum disruption. What happens when anyone can make it appear as if anything has happened, regardless of whether it did or not? Let's look at this short film we have on that difficult question.
All this information is coming from all these different sources. And it's getting harder and harder and harder to understand and to figure out for ourselves what is actually true and what is not.
And I want you all to know that we are fighting the fake news. It's fake, phony, fake.
Fake news came out of the 2016 election. That's when it became a thing.
One of the scariest advancements in AI recently has been the machinery that can be used to create fake video and fake audio.
Especially our friends who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender. I visited with the families of many of the victims on Thursday.
I think the technology will get to the point where even a video forensic expert will not be able to tell what is actually fake and what is not. It wouldn't be far-fetched to think of it as being used as maybe a cause for war sometimes. A country releasing a video that shows other countries loading nuclear missiles, and ready to launch, they might use that as a cause to preemptively strike that country.
So Aviv, you are known for being one of the first to warn Silicon Valley in 2016 about the growing threat of fake news on social media. What led you to do that, and what was their reaction?
I'm technologist, went through sort of the normal path as we described earlier of going to MIT and working at tech companies. And all that while I was sort of looking at what I was always cautious, what is the actual impact of this stuff that I'm creating and the things that my peers are putting out into the world. On the side, I'd read about journalism and the history of different movements and the way in which technology has in the past impacted our society. And it really seemed to me at one point that we were on the verge, we'd created something that, as Jaron spelled it earlier, that just makes the bad actors rise to the top. That rewards sensationalism, that rewards misinformation. And in concert with other the other things that were happening in the world, and these recommendation engines and the ways in which social, you get social proof almost from spreading these things, from putting out this sensational stuff that then gets you the attention on these platforms. It seemed like there was this almost this set of forces that were all driving toward an increase in the attention toward this content that just was not necessarily conducive to a functioning democratic state. And even worse, when you were looking at what's happening in the developing world, that was conducive toward polarization that led to violence. And so seeing all that come together, I became very concerned, and sort of the response from the technology sector was basically, either there's not really any problem, or there's maybe might be a problem, but it's not, there's nothing we can do about it. So our hands are tied.
So you were worried about them prioritizing the number of clicks sometimes, for example, over ethics.
It wasn't really even prioritizing it over it. It was more just that there wasn't attention, there wasn't interest in this problem. There wasn't people who were in charge of caring about, not just, let's say, is our data going to be stolen by a hacker, but can our systems be used to hack people's brains, essentially? I mean, as Tristan Harris says, like, can it be used to make us believe things that aren't true? Can it take us down? Can the systems that we create lead us down conspiracy theory rabbit holes just because of the incentives that come out of those systems?
So you think the worst is yet to come in what you call a full-blown, I think you said information apocalypse or something like that? You think it's still on the way and quite possible?
I mean, I've been hardened over the past 3 months, 6 months, year to really see some of the platforms start to take these threats seriously. To sort of no longer say our hands are tied and say, actually, we are all hands on deck on this. And that's true to varying degrees. And I think that's a step in the right direction for what you could call sort of 2016 era fake news, like the misinformation and disinformation spread through social platforms and through places like YouTube and Instagram and even Pinterest. But there's this sort of new wave that's on the horizon of not just what the distribution platforms can allow, not just what Facebook and YouTube can spread, but also what are the types of information that we can create and how convincing can they be and how easy is it to do that?
Tim, is this inevitable? You've talked about something called deep fakes. Porno, being able to use AI to impose anybody's face anywhere you want.
Sure.
These deep fakes are already happening. What's your biggest concern with all of this?
Yeah, so this is an incident that happened recently, and I think is a sign of things to come in a lot of ways. Some of the tools of machine learning, the sort of commodity level tools, are now able to generate pretty believable fakes. And it turns out that, like many things on the internet, it ends up getting used for pornography. And this is exactly what we saw in the deepfakes case. So this is essentially a machine learning program that allows you to learn a representation of someone's face and then to impose it realistically onto any other face in a video. And so this was kind of an early demonstration of what I think a lot of Aviv is talking about is, you can imagine these techniques certainly being used for this purpose, but then you start to think about, the extent to which it's used in, a political context, right? And whether or not it presents sort of another layer of problems that we're seeing bouncing around in the space.
Creepy possibilities. Brett, you've come at this issue of fake news from a somewhat different perspective, I think. You say people often ask, how can people be so stupid to believe and engage this way? And you tell them the entire interface is made to make you believe this way. How is it so?
Right, so I got very frustrated when the fake news story, the story about fake news is sort of breaking, everyone's paying attention to it, how often I heard the meme, I guess, that people are stupid and lazy for believing in fake news. And so I would suggest that a lot of the people's susceptibility or propensity to believe what they're seeing on various platforms is a function of the design of the platforms. So if you're on a social media network, to be named, you guys can figure out which one you want. If it's designed for, optimized in its design for rapid clicking, quick scrolling, or certain forms of engagement that based on profit, where the money is to be made or where data is to be gathered, right? That sort of disencourages or disincentivizes people to stop and think or deliberate or research or ask deeper questions about the content that they're receiving. And so one species of fake news problem is a function of making profit, right? Sort of creating content to get clicked, right? They could care less, those purveyors of that kind of content could care less about convincing you or changing your beliefs. It's just click to make money, and the platform enables that. The other species is a species of content that's all about propaganda or changing beliefs or influencing how someone approaches a problem. And oftentimes that's not at all about making money, it's about changing beliefs. And to deal with that, you need some form of judgment about the quality, the veracity, the sort of provenance of the information itself, or the nature of the content. And our current social media platforms struggle on both fronts, both in terms of being designed for sort of certain kinds of engagement that enable a for-profit model, and on the other hand, for not wanting to engage in the development of editorial judgment or the exercise of editorial judgment by human beings, because that risks putting them in sort of a content moderation position. Now that's started to change since the fake news sort of story has broke.
You've talked about this has created a diseased techno-social environment, and that we're suffering from an engineered complacency. Does that frighten any of you? Does it frighten you? Engineered complacency?
Maybe I should explain what I mean, and then you guys can tell me if it frightens you. It's meant to frighten. No, but I mean, what I mean by engineered complacency is that much of the environment is designed in a way that repeat interactions in the environment lead you to feel as if it's futile to resist, it's hard, there are no other options. So if you think about the easier example than the fake news context is maybe online contracting. Right? So what do you do when you see an I agree button pop up on a website? Not always, but most people, most of the time, click I agree, right? As you're supposed to, by virtue of both the design of the site and the interface, as well as the nature of the take it or leave it interaction that you're having, the nature of the transaction. Plus, the fact that your repeat interactions with that interface over time. So even if you thought, you know what, maybe I'll stop and think about the legal relationship I'm entering into for some of the websites that I'm visiting, or some of the apps that I'm downloading, or some of the devices I'm installing in my home, how do you decide which of the many different encounters with the interface would cause you to stop and think?
Indeed, that raises another question. Are we actually changing the way the brain operates? To what effect? Is this, Tim?
Well, I would say I'm not a neuroscientist, but I mean, I think there is habit formation, right? I think there's no doubt about that. And I think one of the things that Brett's pointing out, which I think is really great, is that your experience of certain elements online train you for how you behave in future experiences with that, right? So I could even imagine a sort of strange world that we're in right now, where we say everybody gets together and they all agree that this situation is really bad and we should do something about it. And we actually change like how the design of the software looks, but actually people's behaviors are actually stuck in a format that will make those behaviors sticky over time, right? So you could actually imagine, like, let's just bust up and shut down Facebook tomorrow, whether or not it actually recreates itself as a result of the fact that the market now is sort of entrained in certain ways. I think that's an interesting possibility and a really challenging one if you think about the fact that these two variables are actually related, right? That people are influenced, but then they actually kind of influence the production of the system in return.
Aviv, you're nodding vigorously there.
Oh, and I was just agreeing that I think this is another example of sort of the entrenchment of power, where here it's not even power in a particular organization, but it's power in a particular almost like process or way of using yourself and your brain and your environment.
And I mean, I would add, I agree, and I would say it, and yet it is power in a particular organization. I have never known a product manager or engineer to, get promoted for reducing engagement. Right, there are certain types of incentive structures that are driving the culture and ecosystems of these companies, and even if you're engaging with sort of propaganda that is not there to make money for clicks, the longer you stay on a site, the more sort of adrenalizing content you're exposed to, the more ads they show you, right? So there is a monetary incentive in these sort of ad business platforms to keep people on the site, which I think, the politics of that are becoming clear, the risks of that are becoming clear, but the business model sort of remains pretty sclerotic.
Yeah, and Brett, I'd love to add like one wrinkle to this discussion though too, because I think a lot about the sort of catch-22 that platforms find themselves in, right? Because they can say, okay, we're not going to take action, in which case the public is like, you're negligent, you didn't take action. And they're like, okay, so we're going to take action. And then they're like, you're imposing your ethical will on me, right? And I think this actually is part of the tricky thing that needs to be dealt with, because I think when people ask the question, Facebook, do you have a responsibility here? The question is, like, should they be the ones who are delegated that responsibility? That ends up being, I think, a very interesting and tricky question. And I worry about situations where we say they could just do better, because in some ways it sort of reinforces their position in making a lot of these decisions as well, right? And so we may need to actually even rethink the sort of governance of how these things are designed in a much bigger way.
Yeah, I would caution against us-them mentality in general. I mean, so I think oftentimes, but it varies by context and it varies by the technology we're talking about.
Tell us, on that subject, tell us that example you've talked about before about when your son, I think it was, came home with a Fitbit.
Oh, yeah, so...
Tell us what a Fitbit is, because not everybody knows, and what was your problem with that?
Well, okay, so my problem. So imagine so my first grader comes home from after school, and he's super excited, and he's like, it's almost like I won a prize, I got selected, this is so fantastic, they're gonna give me a free watch, is what he said at first. And I said, a free watch, for what? And eventually he says, well, it's an activity watch, is what they were calling it. And I said, okay, so I don't know exactly what that's going to be like, but I had suspicions. So a day later, I get an email, and it's a letter from the school informing me that he's been selected to be part of a fitness program where they're distributing Fitbit. Well, they weren't Fitbits; they were called Activity Watch, a different company that makes them. There's a federal government grant supporting the program. They're giving out Fitbits, activity watches that are going to sort of monitor their activity levels. And in the course of the letter, it says, your kids should wear them. Don't worry about taking it off during bath time or when they're sleeping. Just keep it on for like 2 weeks, no problem. And there's not a word in the entire letter about opting out, about privacy. So I teach privacy law as well. And so the first thing I'm thinking is, who's collecting what information about who, when, who's getting it, how is it going to be used? I'm sort of starting to freak out. My hair's going up. I'm running around the house like, I can't believe this. So I go to I actually went to pick up my kid from school the next day, and I'm talking to people on the playground, and I find out who the PTA is, person I got to talk to. But none of the other parents, no one on the PTA, no one at the school board, nobody thought at all about it. It was just sort of like, yeah, sure, this is great. We got a shiny new technology. We're fighting obesity. It's with money coming from the federal. Yay, 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 win, win, win. And I said, let's think about it a little bit more. And so I wrote a letter to the school district. And I think the line that really caught their attention was when I said something like, I'm not sure you've thought through the 24/7 child surveillance program that you're designing. and all of a sudden there was, whoa, and I get a phone call, what, child surveillance, wait, that's not what we're doing. They didn't think of it it didn't even occur to them to think of it that way. But it's exactly what it was. Right? It's exactly what it was. And so I had meetings with the general counsel, and they figured out how to do better informed consent through their letter, but it really wasn't, I didn't solve the problem, unfortunately, I have to admit. But the biggest problem, and this is I'll end with it, I know I'm talking for a while, but the biggest problem to me was this. It's not, I care about the privacy, I care about the surveillance, I care about who gets what data, and all of that matters. But what also matters, what may be more important, is the subtle social engineering of an entire generation of kids' preferences regarding bodily surveillance, right? So it's not the act of information being collected. It's that they learn in school through a trusted entity instead of trusted relationships to just slap on a device and feel comfortable. This is another engineer complacency type idea. They just learn that that's okay, and they don't think to question about who's getting the information, whether this is a technology they should use, or even what it means. So I said to the school district, this is not necessarily a throw the technology out. Maybe if you actually study it and it turns out that it's really good for combating obesity or something, which has not been proven. That's not why they did it.
Indeed, and this is only spreading faster. Alexa can now be asked to order some more paper towels from the store, and whatever device, smart refrigerator or TV, could be picking up conversations. They're going to be just going to agree to anything, or are people going to open their eyes now? I mean, the rest of you must have strong feelings about this.
I mean, yeah, I wonder actually a little bit about, and I'm concerned about the sort of what I call the Overton window of crisis here. The Overton window of crisis. So Overton window, it's a concept from political science that talks about like what's politically acceptable, right? And the notion is that certain events occasionally will happen that will widen that window, right? Where someone breaks various norms in politics, and suddenly a whole lot of activity is allowed that it wasn't allowed before, or becomes plausible in a way that wasn't. And I think there was a view actually early on around these privacy debates, which is, okay, people don't care about privacy right now, but we just need to wait until the first big crisis, right? And the first big data breach, and then everybody will care about privacy, right? And then that moment came and went, and it came and went, and came and went, and came and went. And you get this feeling now that actually like that state of affairs has been normalized in a way that actually makes it quite difficult to mobilize change politically within an industry. I was talking to a person who does product management recently, and I was like, oh, well, this product you're building, you could kind of improve it in XYZ ways. And he said, well, we're gonna get blamed by the public anyways, no matter what we do. So we're just gonna do it, right? And I think that's a really interesting phenomenon where basically the response has been so kind of built into the process that that creates a level of apathy onto itself.
Yeah. And the effectiveness of dissent has been sort of muted so much that that's just part of it. You look at the media for a while, there may be some stories about it, but it's not actually, there is no sort of effective organizing. I mean, I guess another thing about this is, I find the current framework of privacy kind of broken to talk about a lot of what we're speaking about, right? I don't know that I've ever personally felt or detected harm from a privacy breach, although I've been in all sorts of databases that have leaked because of egregious security practices. But I do know that we have collective harms, right? And I think we need to begin thinking about these things collectively, and we need to begin. It's not I keep my personal data safe. It's that we have major interests, the federal government and the sort of smartwatch or whatever it is, large tech companies who are interested in understanding this data and then creating profiles of us based on the data, right? So I may not have contributed my data, but I am suddenly profiled because there is a model about childhood activity that who knows where that's going to go. Is that going to be used to sort of weight college admissions? Will that be sent to insurance companies to see whose family gets insurance, right? But we don't, we have not asked for sort of transparency or oversight into these kinds of processes and assumptions. And so when we talk about privacy, it's often sort of a very thin debate because it's, I don't have time to do my laundry, let alone like read through a TOS and then take responsibility for where all of my data is, right?
And I think that one of the other things to really keep in mind here is that there are really hard trade-offs to be made when you're thinking about privacy. So like one example is if let's say you're talking about misinformation in the 2016 election, or even stuff that's being spread in let's say in Myanmar, where you might have people creating fake accounts, and those fake accounts are spreading this propaganda, right? And that propaganda is causing violence, or it's misinforming voters. Well, how does a Facebook go and actually detect those fake accounts? Well, they're looking at the IPs of all these users. They're looking at every single signal they can possibly get on that user and comparing it to what they know are sort of real users, and to tell the difference. And so if they don't have that data, they can't make that comparison, then that makes their job a lot harder in protecting our democracy, if they're actually trying to do that, which they now essentially are. And so I think that there are some very, very difficult balances that we need to strike in order to ensure that we protect our democracy, we protect our privacy, we protect our ability to speak freely. All of these things are sort of in the balance, and there's a lot of values that are in tension.
And so you set up the big question, and we're now going to, I guess, move to the inevitable, hopeful side of this. What are the, if we can find one, what are the fixes? What are we to do? Tim, how can we make this AI more ethical?
Sure. So one of the things I think about, particularly related to this discussion, is the delegation question that I mentioned a little while back, right? Which is that, particularly after 2016, we're kind of in this tough spot where we're basically like, companies just solve the problem. Well, we feel really uncomfortable about Facebook telling us what's true or not. All right, well then let's pass a law. And then you're like, oh, well, like we don't want governments to tell us what's true or not. And so there's actually this moment of like, we have to delegate to these two wolves where both of them, like we feel actually pretty uncomfortable working with them on issues of truth, for instance. And there seems to be particularly after 2016, there's a general sort of implosion, I think, in our faith around the ability for like communities to self-organize and deal with some of these problems themselves. And I think that there is good intellectual work to be done in terms of trying to figure out how platforms can make those things more robust.
Do you think Europe is on the right track with their new approach, which is called...
that's another 90-minute panel, I'm sorry.
Well, let's let people know about that possibility. GDPR it's called, which is General Data Protection Regulation. Do you think that it gives people the right to opt out of ad targeting, hopefully, to protect personal data, to contest decisions made by algorithms, to appeal for human intervention? Do you think that's the right approach to take?
Well, I guess my answer is in two parts. The first one is I believe in a balance of power between these entities, right? Like between the corporate entities that might make decisions around this and the governments that are attempting to impose some rules on the space. So I think the GDPR as kind of an assertion of like the fact that companies have not fully won this game and that they actually can still kind of rattle the chain of these companies is something good and valuable. I think the second piece, though, is that there's much within the GDPR which is still undefined. And so we actually don't know yet, right? It will actually be resolved like many things are in the law, which is through an endless series of lawsuits. So,
if we have time for that.
Yes.
Meredith, on similar lines, China has something called a social credit system, a rating eventually intended for every citizen, a kind of extended version of what we already have in this country with our credit ratings, which are getting more and more automated. But China's saying that it's going to be having data regarding economic and social status that could be used for everything from getting into school jobs to jobs and all sorts of things. Everybody will have a special kind of social credit system. This is Orwellian. How far from that are we here, do you think?
This is the optimistic part of the panel.
Optimistic if we can figure it out and get our minds around it, and that's exactly the problem, I think.
I mean, I think China's social credit score is implemented. It is now barring millions of people from local travel because their social credit score has fallen below a certain mark.
Social credit score in China.
It exists already. It is implemented.
It's already implemented.
It is there, and it picks up your friend networks, it picks up your social media posting, any dissent you may have been detected to participate in, your credit history, your schooling, all of the stuff we already have online.
That's Big Brother Plus. That's terrifying to me.
Well, I mean, I would say it's happening in similar ways through sort of a market-based approach in the U.S. We have a company called HireVue, which is sells algorithmic hiring solutions to large corporations. And this company basically sells sort of facial recognition models. So if you interview with this company, you will be recorded, and your face will be analyzed by these models, and they will see, what are you feeling? Is this the face of a winner? And I mean, it's flip, but it's serious because they're also, they model what a winner looks like based on a composite of top performers in this company. Now, this is being used by Goldman Sachs, just beat, haha. And we can look at, the way in which that really replicates the kind of social credit score through different means, right? A top performer at Goldman Sachs probably fits a very narrow demographic profile. So what kinds of inequalities are you replicating, and what are the checks on such replication? Because if you scratch the science here, which I won't have time to get into, most of the claims about these sort of, facial recognition and affect detection are based on flimsy to completely discredited, kind of claims made by sort of psychologists in the 70s that have now been commodified because they fit a certain business model. So my answer is, I'm not sure where I'm going. I think it's frightening. I think it's already happening, and we need to be asking sort of how is it happening here, even if we don't have a large social credit score moniker, above it as sort of, as applied by the state.
So it's like an uncontrolled sort of credit rating system gone more berserk, and we don't know who's controlling it, if anybody is. It may be accidental.
Well, in China, it's the state. Here we have sort of different organizations. It's a more piecemeal approach, but I would say all of the infrastructure, all of the technology is set to, sort of put it in motion if we wanted a kind of larger.
Right. And Aviv, I see you nodding a great deal. And we're hearing also every week from the platforms that are stepping up. Twitter says it's going to limit tweets from people behaving badly, and Facebook has just detailed policing for sex, terror, and hate content. Do you think they're going far enough?
I think there's a number of steps that are in the right direction. There's going to be some steps that backtrack as we learn more and as we discover that, oh wait, this isn't exactly what we wanted. And I think that's part of this process. And I'm happy that we're actually on this process as opposed to just ignoring it, which was sort of, the status quo 2 years ago when, they said, fake news was a 2016 problem. That's in the US, right? A lot of the rest of the world has been, dealing with misinformation that's very deeply affecting their political systems for, 5, 10 years even. So, I mean, I think that there are some some things that really do need to happen, and they're starting to happen within these organizations. In particular, you've got, we need to have empowered teams that can look at the impacts of the technologies on these things that we care about, on let's say our democracy, on the inter-community trust, so that you're not just increasing polarization. If you don't have someone who's paid to ensure that your platform isn't deeply polarizing things, well then your growth team that's trying to get more users and trying to get more action might unintentionally just do that. There has to be that back and forth, and they have to be empowered enough to sort of push back.
This fascinating possible solution to some of it. Empowered by whom? I mean,
well, both within the organization and ideally with some sort of external accountability, where you across these organizations, whether there's a number of different structures, but the idea is that you not only have some sort of internal structure that's keeping an eye on this with people who their job responsibility is to maintain some of these things that we care about, but you also have outside of the company some way in which you're able to see, oh, is that company doing a good job at this? And whether that's through regulatory process, maybe not. But I think that there has to be some structure that creates those power dynamics.
So an independent, idealistic new profession that we need to live in this new world.
I mean, I don't know that it's new. I mean, social scientists have been doing this sort of work for a million years. Maybe not a million. Don't quote me on that. Maybe, I don't know.
Feels like it.
But I think the combination of sort of the people looking at how the technology is impacting society, and really sort of cross-functionally, and having teams that are doing that and that is their focus to understand the way these platforms are impacting things. And I think even beyond that, when you're talking about something like these deep fakes, that's about not just research not just stuff that's happening in these companies, in these platforms, but it's happening in research labs, where you have researchers who are just like, oh, wouldn't this be cool? Oh, I can get a good paper out of this. And that's great, I love good papers, I love cool things. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't be looking at sort of what are the potential negative impacts. And one thing that I've been really excited to see is people within the academic community starting to really think about this deeply. And there's actually, as of now, as of a few days ago, if you go to negativeimpacts.org, there's this, this group, the ACM Young Computing Fellows, ACM Computing of the Future, something along those lines, where they're looking at the ways in which we can improve the peer review process to really incorporate not just the positive impacts of a technology, but also keeping in mind the negative impacts.
And one thing that occurs to me listening to all of you is that one thing we clearly need is for all of us to become much more conscious of our vulnerabilities, and that's something that needs to be taught by everybody, so that we can understand our own psychological vulnerabilities to these abuses you're talking about. So let's take a last round of thoughts from all of you. What happens to us if we don't manage to create truly effective checks and balances? If we don't, where are we headed? Tim?
Well, I think it's an exacerbation of a lot of the trends that you see right now. I mean, it's not, with a lot of these issues, I think you don't have to necessarily speculate about the far off future, because I think in many ways it's here, right? And I think a lot of what we're saying on this panel is that a lot of those trends are set to accelerate over time. And I think we really do need to think about what are things, not just within the organization, but Aviv mentioned briefly transparency. I think there are things that can be done to kind of alert the public in a much bigger way.
And to be precise, these trends are already here, but we can't be sure that anybody's controlling them. In other words, they've become a sort of a natural product of these trends.
Right, and I think those are two types of challenges, right? You have the challenge of kind of intentional harm, right? But I think a great deal of the issues that we see with a lot of these technologies are in fact sort of the negligence harms, right? The harms that we would expect you, if you were a responsible person, to do, but that the actors who are responsible for these decisions don't think are their responsibility.
All right, we have just a couple of minutes left. So your thoughts about where we're headed if we don't get,
I mean, we're clearly headed to climate crisis. We're clearly headed to a lot of really serious issues that relate to this and don't relate to this. But I want to back up a little and make space for the question: what world do we actually want? Do we want Facebook to be negotiating with the U.S. government to determine sort of truthiness, or do we want Facebook? right? Do we want late capitalism, right? What do we want this to be? And then think about what types of technologies could you build or avoid building to create that? Because I think we fall into the trap of accepting the status quo and then trying to tweak it around the edges. And it's very clear that that's not at this point working, and that a number of the major social problems we're facing are enmeshed deeply with the major technological issues, and they're being exacerbated in ways that are very complex to tease apart from a systems perspective. So I would want to start with the imaginative potential of how do we create a better world, and then see, do we want these sort of bulwarks of power in this world, in that world?
And would I be right in guessing that you think it shouldn't be something done in secret or private, but openly with the whole world involved in the discussion?
I mean, I'm not imagining the biggest round table ever where everyone gets 2 minutes, right? Like, I think there are process questions there, but I do think this needs to come from the experts. In a lot of cases, the experts are the communities on the ground affected by these technologies who don't ever get into the fancy conference rooms where they're making these decisions.
Left. Quick response from each of you.
Yeah, I think that you nailed it, and I would add just that these technologies, especially the way in which they affect our environment, what we believe, what actions we take, that impacts sort of governance more broadly. It really impacts whether or not we can handle any of the challenges that are going to come on our plate in the next few years. And so if we don't solve, misinformation, for example, maybe you can't solve climate change, and then you can't solve the way in which AI is going to affect work. They're all really enmeshed together. And so I really think about this as, how do you ensure that we can, as a very interconnected world, function effectively? How do we keep civilization sort of on track?
Okay, and the last word. Sorry to interrupt. We have just one.
Where are we headed if we don't fix it? I think we're heading to the science fiction dystopia where we are more and more of our lives are predicted and determined by technological systems controlled by a few. How we avoid that, the Constitution's most fundamental issue for us to confront in the 21st century is how to sustain our freedom to be off, so that we're not always on. How to build techno-social environments through technology and social institutions that preserve underdetermined environments within which we can develop, play, experiment, interact with each other in ways that allow us to develop our own lives rather than have them determined for us.
Sounds something for the lawyers, the politicians, and everybody to get involved with, including you nerds who have given us all this stuff. Let's give a round of applause. Thank you for sharing.